The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
Welcome, everyone, to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is a 21-minute or less weekly podcast to help you get your message out, grow your business, and build your bottom line. Let me help you bring your marketing and advertising into the 21st century. My name is David Garofalo. I've been doing podcasting since 2010, and by doing so, I created myself a six-figure income from the podcast alone, all the while helping my business grow and building my bottom line. This is a 21-minute podcast, so let's get the podcast clock started, and here we go. Today, how long should your podcast be? So you heard me at the beginning of this. This is a 21-minute podcast, and there's a lot of reasons why it's a 21-minute podcast. We'll get to a lot of those reasons. But this is the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. So what I'm doing here is branding also at the same time. It's Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, so the podcast is 21 minutes. Why not 20 minutes? Because it's Studio 21, so there's the little branding that's happening with this podcast as it's going. But how long should your podcast be? How long in minutes for a podcast? 10 minutes? 30 minutes? An hour, 2 hours, or even longer, or shorter. There's many of them out there, and I've looked a lot into this, getting prepared for this week's podcast. How many days a week, or a month, or every day, or multiple times a day, twice a month, or once a month, or whenever you feel like it? When are you doing your podcast? How often? How many episodes? How long should it last? Should it be a one-year show and it ends? Should it keep going on? Is it a countdown? Is it 10, 9, 8, 100 episodes? How long should your podcast be? Your podcast, your message, and the future success of your podcast depends on figuring out the answer to this question. And here's a quick answer. It depends. It depends on you and your podcast. It's not the same for everybody. So as I tell you this, you figure out what's best for you. Are you a news podcast in need or want to get the latest breaking news out there as soon as possible? Maybe you need to do a daily podcast if that's the case. Maybe you're an industry podcast like a magazine show, and you think a monthly podcast would be enough. Or, God forbid, a bi-monthly or bi-weekly. And I say God forbid because that's really going to mess up with the listener. Did he have it last week? Did he have it last month? Is this the month that they have it? Is this the week they have it? So one thing I'll say to you is be consistent on it. Make it easy for the listener. At least be there every week or every month or every day or whatever you decide to do. Weekdays, weekends. Let me start by saying that, in my opinion, it would be a mistake if you weren't consistent. People won't be there. The fact of the matter is, the sweet spot is somewhere between everything that I just said to you. So let's go to the averages. The longest uninterrupted live podcast ever, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, is 150 hours and 30 minutes. By Lifestyle at TV in Germany in February 2011. That's the Guinness Book of World Records saying that that's the longest podcast. I want to know who the people are that listened to that whole podcast. I bet there's none. 150 hours and 30 minutes. The shortest podcast is a podcast called 30 Seconds or Less. That's the name of the show, but it's not the time of each episode. It's a little longer in most cases, but you're talking about under 5 minutes podcast. But the name of the podcast is 30 Seconds or Less. It's actually a religious program. The average podcast, going through all the podcasts, see what the average is 30 minutes. 30 minutes the listener can consume 25 minutes of a 30-minute podcast. This has been shown up. The average person listens to about 25 minutes of the 30-minute podcast. And this is important to know. They might be cutting out the ads at the beginning or the end of the podcast when they cut out. You're done saying what you're going to say, and now you're going to thank all the people that have sponsored the show, and they cut out at that point. And if that's the reason that that's happening, you're doing a disservice to your advertisers or your supporters for the show. So you need to know that. Maybe it's best to start at the very beginning and get that out of the way. Or, as I said in an old podcast, when should you be doing it? Getting your message out there, and that would be sprinkled throughout is my option, my thought of the best way to end up doing it. You see, this podcast is 21 minutes or less, and there's a few reasons for it. As I said, one of the reasons, branding, Studio 21, 21-minute podcast or less, right? I'm going to try to get this out as fast as I can. Get the marketing and advertising into the 21st century. Again, there it is, 21. Again, I'm using it as much as possible because I'm using this as branding. And I think it's important. I want you to listen to the whole podcast, so I want you to know that this is not going to be a commitment to you listening to this podcast. It's 21 minutes or less. Therefore, you got time for this, right? You do, because here you are. To help you choose the correct time for your podcast, you should know that the average podcast is about 30 minutes. But the average consumed, as I said, is about 25 minutes. So why does that matter? 20% of all podcasts are listened in the car. 20% of everybody listening to a podcast are doing it. 85% listen to all or most of the podcast in a 30-minute podcast. But you can always resume, remember. There's pause. It's not like it's a radio show. It's not TV. Podcasting is awesome because the listener can pause, can stop at that point and get to it later if they want to. And you know, they get a phone call, they hit pause, they go back to it, they end up at work because that's their commute to work. The average commute, about 25 minutes. They get to work, the show isn't over, they hit pause, and they resume later on. So actually, the 25-minute threshold is a great time to have your podcast end at 25 minutes because that is the person commuting to work. But also, there's nothing wrong with a 50-minute podcast because the 50-minute is the sweet spot also. It's the person going to work and then resuming when they get back in the car on the way home, and the commute ends up being 50 minutes, 25 minutes to work, 25 minutes coming back. Any longer than that, you're asking for a commitment now from the listener, and that commitment is to listen again tomorrow or later on in the day. You're asking 3 things from them at that point. I've been doing my personal podcast. It's called The Cigar Authority, weekly since 2010. I told you I created a 6-figure income from it, but in order to do that, to make money with it, I had to make it 2 hours long. I'm going to explain that, why, in just 1 minute. Stick around.
If you're in the area of Boston North into southern New Hampshire and you're thinking about doing a podcast, there is a place you have to see. It's called Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. Located right over the border into Salem, New Hampshire, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe is a live, working, full-service podcast and vodcast, that's video on demand, studio. All professional equipment, professional producer, and total distribution of your podcast is done for you. Would you like search engine optimization for more people to find your business or better ranking on Google? Well, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe can do it all for you for far less than you think. Schedule a free 21-minute no-obligation consultation by going to www.studio21podcast.cafe. That's studio21podcast.cafe. Now, back to the program.
And we're back. And today we're talking about how long should your podcast be. We're at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe podcast, and this podcast is 21 minutes or less. Part of that reason is branding, but another part of that reason is we know that people like to listen on a commute. And that commute, the average commute is 25 minutes. Therefore, we're keeping the podcast down below that so you can listen to it on the way to work or all the way home from work. Looking over the analytics, the stats, you can learn a lot by doing that. The average podcast listener listens to 5 shows per week. And those shows are, on average, 30 minutes on average each. That's 2.5 hours a week people are listening to podcasts. That's on average. I have a podcast, as I said, called The Cigar Authority. I've been doing it since 2010. I built it to a 1.6 million download per year listenership. I made well over $100,000 this year in profit from the advertising that happened, and over $250,000 in reoccurring yearly revenue that happens on there, and we'll get to that on other shows of reoccurring revenue, sales that happen because of the podcast. With unmeasurable and other branding and marketing benefits that happen to me by doing that podcast. And you can and should be doing it. If you're not doing a podcast, you should be doing it for a lot of reasons. Those are just some of them. I never knew the stats when I started, and again, that was 2010. So I made a lot of mistakes. In 2010, when I started the show, I made it 2 hours long. And I'll tell you, it was a big mistake. There was no need of it. But over the years, there's a big reason why it took me a few years to get it off the ground. That was a lot of the 2-hour commitment that I was asking my listener to do it. But today, it is still 2 hours long, and I could make that change if I wanted to. But I did not make that change. I created segments to ease people coming back to it. Segmentation within the show, so somebody can stop at a certain point and then resume later. The segmenting of the show, we're going to save that for another episode and tell you how and why you should do that. But that's what I did to help it. But I must keep it 2 hours long now because we have over 25 commercial contents within the show. And if those are a minute long, I have 25 minutes or more in advertising alone, so it's hard to squeeze that into a 25-minute show.
That'd be tough.
Yeah. So it is 2 hours long. Again, big mistake on my point, but we turn that big mistake into a profitable thing as we go along. So, but if you're doing a podcast now and knowing these stats that you heard, you can always bring your podcast down and hope to gain more listenership for it. The fact of the matter is, when you're done talking, it doesn't have to be a certain time length. This is 21 minutes or long, or shorter is the goal. If I'm done in 10 minutes, I'm going to wrap it up and I'm going to stop talking because I have nothing more to say, and I don't need to keep the listener on here for no reason. Let's look at attention span. Common estimates of attention span of healthy teenagers and adults range between 10 to 20 minutes. Your attention span, 10 to 20 minutes, that's it. So to keep somebody paying attention to a 2-hour program is probably not really happening. They're multitasking at that point. They're not really paying attention. We're keeping this down to 21 minutes or less, and I'm hoping you're paying attention to what I'm saying here. What do you think the length of a sitcom on TV is? 30-minute show? It's not 30 minutes. It's actually 22 minutes because they know the attention span of a person. Lots of research gets put into attention span, and that is for TV. So we can learn from that. We're not television, but we can learn from it. Is your podcast much different? The answer is no. You want people to be paying attention to your show. So my thought is 25 minutes or 50 minutes, the commute back and forth. No longer than 25 minutes or no longer than 50 minutes. That should be the ideal thing. Is what I think. You decide from the information that I gave you. I look out there and I see lots of successful podcasts that are not in the range that I tell you they are. Some of them are very long podcasts, and they're very profitable and very successful podcasts. Much of my own, the Cigar Authority podcast, 2 hours long and successful. There's lots of very, very short podcasts that are very successful and everything in between. How long should your podcast be? It's going to be up to you. But the fact of the matter is not a minute longer than it has to be. When you're done, that's it. Wrap it up and end the thing. It doesn't have to reach a certain milestone. That's the beauty of it. And you don't want to keep the person listening hanging on to listening to nothing. You want them actually wanting more, wanting to come back more for next week's show. Do not keep your listener listening while you're filling up time. Have respect for their time. When you're done getting the message out, wrap it up. Because it's a podcast, any time is fine, but you don't have to look at the clock. You should to a certain degree, but you really don't have to pay attention to it all that much. So that's my 21 minutes or less podcast. How long is yours? If you want to talk to me, message me at the Contact Us page at the Studio 21 Podcast.cafe. That's Studio 21 Podcast.cafe. Set up a meeting with me and let me show you Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. I'll even buy you a cup of coffee. Next week, the live podcast. Instead of recording it and then editing it, how about doing it live and living with what you get? That's what we do here. This show is live, no editing, in front of a live audience and here at Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. It has benefits, and we'll talk about them next week, doing a live podcast. That's my 21 minutes or less, and we are out of here. You've been listening to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, live from the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe on the United Podcast Network.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.